My name is Peter Egan. I am the lead for the Institution of Royal Engineers Sustainability Forum. And today I'm going to chair the webinar and the questions at the end. You will all be aware your cameras have been disabled and your microphones have been disabled. But if you have any questions you'd like to propose to the speakers we have today, please put them in the chat box and we'll propose them to the speakers at the end of the webinar. So let me introduce the Institution of Royal Engineers Sustainability Forum, who we are. We are a forum to promote the science and the art of military engineering and the sustainable aspects of that. So today we've got three great speakers today to go through the topic of what is a sustainable client, and let me introduce them. So first of all, we're going to have Major General David Salpo, who is the Director of Army Basing and Infrastructure for the British Army. He's got over 30 years experience of working in the military engineering sector, and he's commanded units from across the military specialisms, serving in operational theatres, including the Falklands, Afghanistan, and in his earlier career, Zimbabwe. He now leads the UK basing scheme, developing a resilient future for the British Army. We've also today got joining us is Sally Supercliff, who is a chartered civil engineer and chartered environmentalist with a mix of public and private sector experience. Until recently, she led on the net zero strategy for infrastructure at the Environmental Agency, where she was also involved in emergency response. Currently, she's the global head of sustainability and climate change at McDonald's. And lastly but not least, we have Julie Hobbs, who is here to speak with us today, who is the co-director of Reuseful Limited and has provided technical experience and input to sustainable related projects in the built environment for over 25 years. He specialises in resource efficiency and circular economy, in which he has recently completed projects for the UK and the EU policymakers on the implementation of circular economy in the built environment. Julie is currently advising Enfield Council for the Meridian Water Regeneration Development and is a member of various standards committees, including the European SEN TC 350 programme, looking at circular economy, and the British BS committees for BS 8895, material efficiency, B558, sustainability of construction works, and the CB/101 service life planning. So I would like to thank our three speakers for joining us today, and then I'm looking forward, as I'm sure you are, to hearing what they're going to talk to us about today. So the running order we're going to go with today will be Major General David Salpo. He will speak to us about from the client's perspective. Then Sally Southernworth is going to speak to us about it from the contractors, the industry perspective, and then Julie is going to pull it all together at the end for us, and then we will go into a question and answer phase. So I think that's enough of an introduction for me, and I would like to introduce and welcome Major General David Salpo, who will open us today. Sir, I will hand over to you.
Peter, thank you very much indeed for those warm words of introduction. I'll kick off verbally, but if someone can enable me as a presenter as opposed to an attendee, as the box on screen sharing is currently grayed out, I can't share my slides. Okay. But let me kick off in the interest of time, as we've only got a limited amount of time. I think by way of context, first and foremost, the Army is crystal clear, absolutely clear, that tackling this sustainability challenge is not a discretionary activity for us. The consequences of not tackling this are far too profound, and those are environmental consequences, but there are also economic consequences and political consequences. I always reflect on how the UN has framed climate change as an existential threat to humanity. RUSI has also highlighted it's not an energy supply problem or just a green environmental issue, it's also a security threat. And I think that by way of context for defence is critical when you look at global strategic threat trends, you see a direction of travel where the operational threats of the future will be framed by challenges for water, challenges for energy resource, migration on a scale that I think many would consider unimaginable. If you think about temperature rises in Africa, take the Sahel region, and many of us have operated there before. If the Sahel changes from inhospitable to uninhabitable, which some would predict will occur in the next 10 to 20 years, then 30 million people are going to be moving to an area that is more livable in. So in terms of strategic challenges, the threat baseline is really significant. Peter, I still can't share slides. Are they being shared?
Yes, Emma
They are.
Thompson, I'm on your behalf, sir.
Okay, that's great. So we should be on drivers for change. So in terms of drivers for change, I think there's five that I pick out at Army board level. First and foremost, and it's probably the one to finish with as opposed to the one to start with, the MOD has issued its climate change strategy and drafted by Richard Nugent, the old Chief of Defence personnel. He's now the non-exec for climate change on the Defence Board. So there is a bit of MOD policy out there, first and foremost, that frames a scale of ambition and a direction of travel and approach. The operational imperative, I think, is not just about the threat. It's not just about the arena in which we'll operate, but it's also an operational imperative which changes our modus operandi as an army in terms of post-integrated review context. If our army of the 21st century is, as the integrated review, as defence, Britain's defence in a global age opines, is going to be smaller, lighter, more agile, more expeditionary, and the reduction in army numbers means that we have to replace an industrial age of warfare of mass with technology and doing things differently. We cannot operate in the way we've operated before. And what do I mean by that? We cannot operate with the logistic drag, with the long logistic tails of bases like Lashkar, like Camp Bastion, not far off the size of the town of Reading in scale terms, where we have an unsustainable footprint in how we operate. And that leads us to a different approach to how we harness military technology. We don't want to be burdened with fossil fueled vehicles, not just because of the environmental impact, but because of the operational efficacy benefit. I think it costs in Afghanistan, the US, about $500 to shift 1 gallon of diesel into theatre, and that's many multiples for the cost of a gallon of diesel, many multiples. So there's an operational driver. The legislative driver will be clear to all. The climate change agreement, COP26, high expectations, and the emerging legislation, of course, the extant legislation of 2050 and the emerging legislation of 78% by 2035. And again, the targets are going to get sharper and harder as it becomes clearer that we have less time. The efficiency piece, which always captures the eye of those in the resources arena. The Army spends 150 million a year on its utilities bill, gas and electricity. We are inefficient in our estate. We need to improve the efficiency of our estate. That's why we're building 4 solar farms this year and about 76 in a couple of years that follow, because the capex we spend on a solar farm, a couple of million, will pay for itself in 10 years of utilities bill saving. aside from the efficiency in recruiting and retention, because our people expect and demand it, which leads on to the moral imperative to do the right thing for the country and the society that we serve. We have a part to play in fixing the world putting it onto a sustainable footing. That sounds very grand, but when you think defence consumes or emits rather, is responsible and accountable for 50% of government greenhouse gas emissions, government department greenhouse gas emissions, we're a pretty significant offender as a government department. Next slide, please, Emma. So onto my own arena as the Army Sustainability Champion. Why am I the Army Sustainability Champion, as well as the Army's Director of Basic and Infrastructure? Because most of our challenge lies on the estate, and it's a pretty big footprint, as the numbers highlight. 20,000 buildings on the regular estate, another 5,000 on the reserve estate. If you include the defence training estate, for which the Army is the lead TLB, we manage the budget and we give the direction on its investment. We're just shy of 2% of the UK landmass. Next slide, please, Emma. And that equates to an annual running cost. I look after about 10% of the Army budget. That's 1.3 billion a year. Most of that I spend on maintaining an estate that's too inefficient, too big, too carbon offending. We need to lean it out, make it smaller, more efficient, and really invest in a smaller footprint. And by updating and modernising, we'll fix the majority of the problem of the Army's carbon footprint. Over 500,000 tonnes per year. That's 2/3, 64% of the Army's carbon emissions. It's the polar opposite with other services, Navy and Air Force. It's platform based, it's equipment based, it's ships and aircraft. For us, it's the estate. So what are we doing about it? On to slide 5, please. The Army proposition. We're drafting at the moment the Army's strategic directive, CGS's strategic intent, if you like, a glossy that will come out on the back of the MOD's direction on climate change sustainability, the new G paper. And that will be issued probably around September. It will be quite light, high and tight. It will be a bit of CGS intent, vision, and scale of ambition. And it won't, frankly, not to dismiss its importance, but it will frame and play back what we have to commit to in terms of government greening commitments, and just reassure that the Army is on this. It will then be supported by a number of, you could call them annexes and enclosures, but separate directorate plans or directives. There'll be one for our equipment program, there'll be one for our personnel, there'll be one for the support arena through life capability management. There'll be and the first one of those will be for the estate, because 2/3 of the emissions lie in that area. And that will provide a headmark, a framework for the other directorates to produce their plans. What you see on the screen is the roadmap, and just a snapshot of the draft roadmap of our scale of ambition across lines of effort. I won't dissect it in detail, but we're starting to get to a point where we're cascading down government greening target direction through MOD strategy, the new G report, through CGS's vision, into tangible, demonstrable actions and activities with timescales that we can then resource through the annual budgeting cycle process to deliver the change that we need to make. I would caveat the slide you can see now with the roadmap you see as a draft. So please don't quote it directly. Wait for it to be issued in September this calendar year. Critically, the issue of CGS's vision and the infrastructure element of the directive that supports it, with the others to follow, critically will precede COP26 for hopefully obvious reasons that are important in the strategic space. Onto the enablers, please, Emma. So I think just worth, I mean, four enabler headlines, none of them should come as any surprise. Policy, people, partners, and finance. I'll wave top them all. Policy, I mean, for me, this is critical, absolutely pivotal, and I'm delighted with to see the recent government public procurement notice for the spotters out there, 0621, Cabinet Office direction to all government departments, published a few weeks ago, that requires all government suppliers, and this will come into all new contracts from September this year, 30th of September, to have to, number one, showcase their carbon credentials, so to prove that they have a company plan for reaching net zero. So proving their sustainability credentials and publicly proving them. It's got to be published on the company website. And secondly, to then report and evidence the cost, the carbon cost of whatever product or service they're offering to the Army and to Defence or to any other government department. So whether we're buying uniforms, procuring a tank, building a building, or a service for that matter, the carbon cost of that service or product. It'll probably be launched with Defence. Defence has a slight buy for that, and it'll probably, I would suspect, land December this year. Defence contracts do have a degree of freedoms which other government contracts don't, but it will be a couple of months delay. This is the first step, the very first step by the Cabinet Office to showcase how they're holding industry to account to deliver, and I think we'll see increasingly more detail in exactly how to measure that, the frameworks that companies have to apply to. Really important stuff. The people piece, sorry, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to crack on. The people piece, changing culture and mindset, critical. Might want to unpack that in Q&A maybe. We can change policy, changing approach and mindset, critical. Partners, I think the MOD is often guilty of being a very insular department. For all the obvious reasons that we are a bit of a monopoly, not many other people and other government departments deliver lethal force against the Queen's enemies. Therefore, we have a unique role, and a lot of our stuff is compartmented and siloed as a result. This is an arena we need to collaborate across the broadest, deepest range, unlike much of the remainder of the department's business and the Army's business. On the finance side, I think I'd highlight one critical point. It's the ability to, and this is really important to the department at the moment, the MOD and the Army, it's how we monetize carbon. You can apportion, the defence carbon baseline to frontline commands. You can set them targets to reduce, but what will really change everything is when the carbon cost of what we do and how we operate becomes part of the conversation in every balance of investment decision in the annual budgeting cycle process that the Army goes through each year. So in the same way that we would cost in anything else as a KUR, as a KPI, we should monetize carbon, so it is costed in, and not doing it adds a negative cost. We again, there's a whole raft of other stuff in the enabling arena for us to unpack. Onto the last question slide. I'll save questions clearly to the conversation for the other two speakers. I think by way of summary, I would highlight for defence, there's I think 3 areas really, and for the Army 3 areas that we split this challenge down into. The first is this security threat arena. Industrial age warfare of 2 or 3 decades ago, contemporary campaigning of the last 15 years plus in Afghanistan and Iraq that shaped most of our careers. That's changed. Security threats of the future, are going to be driven as much by climate change and the instability that it causes as an indirect or direct consequence as by anything else. So the threat map of what defence and the army needs to respond to will change. Secondly, how the army operates in that arena will change. Our modus operandi, so how we treat the symptoms of climate change consequence, means that the army's operating model will need to adjust. And then thirdly, treating the cause. The time scale we have, and COP26 will showcase this, to act it's 2050 is too late, 2040 is too late. We've probably got 10 years when you talk to the scientists, and there are brighter, more capable people to pitch this. But all the scientific evidence I'm seeing is the time frame is eye-wateringly short. It's been known, but it's really hoving into view at such an alarming rate that the imperative to act will be ever more pressing at an exponential rate in the months and years ahead. Plenty from me, Peter, I think. Back to you.
So thank you for that, and I think that last slide you put up there really capitalises the place we're in at this moment in time. So we'll bring the questions in at the end. So what I'd like to do now is hand over to Sally to get the other side of the questions perspective.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Peter. And hopefully you can see my slides. So the exam question that I've been set today is, what does industry need from its clients, and what is it that Mott MacDonald is doing in response to this? And I found it really quite difficult to sort of think of how I could tackle this massive challenge in just 10 or 20 minutes. So what I've done is identified a number of topics, headlines that I think are relevant to this discussion, and then I'll delve into some of them in just a little bit more detail. I think that with regards to what is it that clients can do, it's in terms of providing that leadership, setting the framework that we can all respond to, and setting some expectations, clear expectations, and they could do that through shaping policies and strategies. And we've just heard that just now from General Southall, so that's great to hear, and we know that a number of our clients are embarking on that journey. It would be really helpful as well for our clients to set goals and targets, clear goals and targets. We have quite a number of organisations across the world now that have signed up to Race to Zero ahead of COP26. It's sharing that with the whole value chain, isn't it? So that we're all aligned in terms of what it is we're trying to deliver together. The third point there I've got is around adopting a sustainable approach, and this builds on what we've just heard in terms of maybe changing the definition of value so that it's not just on financial terms, but is considering carbon, the environment, other factors as well, perhaps well-being and health of local populations. So we're getting that more comprehensive solution and putting a value against that. There are a number of mechanisms available to do that, aren't there? With a number of places are experimenting with the carbon tax, and we've also got natural capital accounting as well, which gives us a methodology for valuing the environment. Next I've got on the list is to build in climate risk in terms of the procurement strategies, specifications and contracts that need to be put in place, so that as we're procuring services and products and goods, that we take into account carbon and other sustainability factors, again, so we're not sort of drilling down to the lowest cost option, and that we're looking stepping back and looking more wholesale at what it is that we're getting and how it's going to impact on the world around us. and writing specifications in that regard as well, and also the contracts that are in place. And I'm a member of a number of different groups and fora, and I do know that BSI and others are looking at strengthening how we approach climate change in various codes and standards. DMRB, for example, is being refreshed for highways, and that'll come online next year. But in the interim, what we need, what we're looking to do is to provide that guidance and support to the engineers and professionals working in the built environment, in construction, in emergency response, so they can make those informed decisions. Next, I've got on the line on the list is that digital approach, and so we need data and information, and we need that to be really easily accessible, and digital formats and tools and products give us that access so that we can make those informed decisions. So digital is that platform that allows and enables that to happen. But of course, that's got a footprint as well. I don't know whether you're aware of the discussions around bitcoins and the cost to the environment of that whole sort of scenario. And then finally, the need to collaborate, and discussions such as this help us to move forward. And also COP26 as a bit of a milestone for us in the UK and in the world. And we look forward to the call to action that comes from that. So what is it that Mott MacDonald is doing in response to that? Well, we've signed up to a science-based target. We've signed up to Race to Zero, and we've achieved carbon neutral status. And I've just commissioned a net zero project team to look at the details of how we deliver net zero by 2040 or sooner. So we're just doing that hindcasting, looking at scenario modelling and looking at what that means for us as a global business. And that means looking at our Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions. So that's interesting. You can see the quote that I've given there from Mike Haig, who's our exec chair, and we've got strong leadership from the top of the business. So my challenge is thinking about what is the impact across all of the different sectors with which we work, the subsectors. Each of them has their own challenges and opportunities. And I think from the analysis that I've done in the last few months, it's evident that there's a lot more opportunities, and it's very exciting in terms of being creative and innovative with regards to bringing different solutions to the marketplace, and as opposed to those that are going to diminish over time as we respond to the climate emergency. And we've got offices around the world, so how do I track what our performance is doing? We've got a number of tools and products that I haven't got time to go into today, but that Power BI, I mean, it's a fantastic tool, isn't it? I'm sure many of you using this, just gives you the ability to slice and dice data and information and give you that sort of pictorial representation of what's happening in whatever aspect that you're considering. So if you haven't played with that as a tool, I definitely recommend it, so I can track our performance in terms of what we're doing in different parts of the world. And this is just the carbon offset that we have in place to offset our carbon emissions, and that's a carbon reduction scheme as well, so we get extra bunny points for that in terms of it actually removing carbon emissions from the world. So just a couple more slides on a couple of the topics that I've raised there. If a client could consider whole life as they're going about their capital investment, that would be just fantastic. So many are constrained by just being able to and looking to afford the capital investment associated with the construction stage. We've got so much national critical infrastructure, so we've got some extraordinary photographs here, and this is from flood risk management. We do deploy extraordinary resources in response to emergencies. and you just have to, it does beg the question, what is it that we can do more to build in that functionality so that we can respond more easily to these incidents, which are becoming more and more challenging, and difficult to manage and address. Working with some of our clients, Anglian Water, they've got a growing set of evidence which is just really compelling, which demonstrates that low carbon solutions can cost less if you're looking at the whole life of an asset management system or an asset base. And so with regards to a number of organisations that have floated green bonds on the marketplace, they've been inundated by the appetite for people to invest and wanting to have that green investment portfolio. So in terms of joining up that green finance together with the needed infrastructure, there's a definite opportunity there. And we've got the TCFD, the task force, which is going to oblige organisations to disclose their how they're managing the climate change risk, and what clients can do. Well, maybe they could sign up to the pilot project. It's going to become mandatory in 2025, but clients can get their houses in order now and start to understand what it is that's going to mean for them as a business. Because I can't imagine that there's an organisation anywhere in the world where either their customer base is going to be impacted by climate change, or their supply chain. It might be their premises, it might be their asset base. It's going to be quite a unique situation, I would think, for anybody to not be impacted in some shape or form by the climate emergency. I'm co-chair of the Climate Emergency Programme at the Institute of Asset Management. And there we have a group of organisations, including clients, who are collaborating on tackling this. Nature-based solutions is certainly part of the wider solution that we're looking to impact on. Here's some examples of what the nature-based solutions might look like. The water industry certainly embraced this quite wholeheartedly, and I think, having worked as an engineer for a number of decades, it's certainly something that's been on the table, but we need to embrace that more fully in terms, and then the impact on well-being is certainly been recognised as we look at green prescriptions that the GPs have put in place for people to be able to improve on their mental health. And so there are all sorts of aspects, and Public Health England are looking at valuing that as well. So that's certainly a fantastic set of evidence and information that we can build into our engineering solutions. I'm heading up the work that we are doing under the Sustainable Development Goals framework, and there's a lot of projects and investigations and research that is ongoing under a number of those topics. Another example of some collaboration here is the vision that was published by the Construction Innovation Hub, and this clearly demonstrates that integrated approach that we need to take for the built and natural environment. So really entwining solutions and being really creative in creating those green and blue spaces. So that's a segue to collaboration. Mott MacDonald's a member of the World Economic Forum, and again there's a number of working groups that are set up looking at all of these various initiatives, all of which are going to help us achieve or tackle the climate emergency. And there's an opportunity for anybody's on the line to be able to be co-opted into helping to solve those problems. And another group is the Net Zero Infrastructure Industry Coalition, and they've published a number of papers And an example of one of the outputs here is going back to that data topic that I referenced, the carbon iceberg, they're calling it. It's around recognizing the quality of the data that we have just currently maybe isn't up to the job of helping us to use it in the way we need to make those informed decisions. So another ask of clients is to consider how they invest in the capture and generation and storage of data and information, as we badly need that as we develop our solutions for the future. So the call to action, we've got the IPCC report that we're the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change report is the latest one is imminent. What's really scary about that is that in January, that was the cutoff, the threshold for which the evidence that they were analysing that was feeding into the scenario modelling for that report. And yet, when you think of the extraordinary events that we've had just in recent months, with the impact of the change in the track of the jet stream, and how that's created these heat domes, and we have the impact of heat islands. We had the deaths in Texas from the cold snap, and then the floods that were exacerbated by the fact that the jet stream held those storm systems in place and prevented them from dissipating as they might have done in past years. So the report that they bring out is going to be alarming, I suspect, and the situation is going to be worse. So I might lose sleep over that. I guess if I was to dwell on that to any great extent. But what I so love about being an engineer and being a professional working in this industry is that I have the opportunity to do something about it. So I look forward to COP26 in November, and we'll understand what the call to action looks like for us. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Sally, thank you for that. And it was great to see how the collaboration of the industry is coming on there. And it leads into a few things. Us as a forum will be declaring in the not too distant future, but I'll save that for another day. What I would like to do now is hand over to our final speaker. Julie, it would be really good if you can come on and show us what we can do about some of these matters.
Hi, yeah, thank you. Hello, everybody. Pleased to be here. Can you see my presentation?
Not at the moment. It's probably just coming through.
No. Okay. Okay, so I'm sharing. I'm spotlighted. I don't think. Why is it not sharing screen?
It's come up now.
Okay, great. Right. So yeah, so my exam question was to focus a bit on circular economy and particularly the built environment in relation to what is a sustainable client. So I'm just going to try and whiz through these. So we've got a bit of time for questions. So I'm assuming people have heard of the term circular economy, but effectively it's moving from a linear economy where we take, make, use, dispose to more of a circular economy. And there's the infographic here shows that for the last maybe 10, 20 years, we've looked at recycling, reuse. So there's a sort of middle phase that we've been in for the last decade or so. But now we're really trying to get into this whole area of circular economy, which is much more about value retention. So trying to keep the value of materials and assets as high up in this hierarchy of value as possible. So I thought I'd just flag up the Resolve framework, which is from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, who sort of coined the term circular economy, because I think it sort of expands the scope from maybe some people might think it's mainly about recycling and reuse, but actually it's quite a bit broader than that. And I'm not going to go through it, but just to sort of flag up, there are different aspects of circular economy that are quite important. So, for example, using renewable materials, looking towards different business models. So, for example, servitization rather than procuring products, virtualization, so sort of dematerialization of goods and services. So, a classic example of that would be moving from videos and DVDs to streaming content. And there's lots of opportunities, obviously, to reduce material use, but also the impact that goes with that as part of this changing to a circular economy. So in terms of the built environment, UK GBC produced some guidance a couple of years ago about how to apply circular economy principles at the project brief stage. So I think this is a really good report to go to, because it sets out at each of the REBA stages, each of the design stages, from concept through to detailed design and handover. What are the sort of things that that clients should be doing to sort of set the agenda and then set the concepts, but then go into more and more detail in terms of exactly what those targets are going to be, and to monitor the progress against those targets. And this has been followed up quite recently. There was a set of webinars by ACAN, so the Architects Climate Against Climate Change Network. And they actually followed each of these stages and did a webinar on each of the stages in relation to circular economy and how you could then practically implement it. So I would definitely refer to those webinars, which I think are still available online, to find out more about these specific stages and what you should be doing as a client. But I thought I want to really focus on the strategic approach to it, and to flag up the fact that within London there's now a requirement for referable developments to produce a circular economy statement. And this is actually quite unique, not only in the UK but also further afield, in terms of having this requirement within planning to produce this circular economy statement. And the strategic approach decision tree, I think, is particularly relevant in terms of starting to think a bit more about the whole life of the asset, where it's at the moment, where it needs to get to, and the stages in between. Because depending on how the asset's going to be used over what period of time, can actually lead to quite different decisions. I think this is a really important stage not to overlook, because actually, if you miss out this stage, you can make some decisions that aren't really going to be in the best interest economically, environmentally, and probably socially as well. So this is really important to consider the asset. So, for example, is there an existing building on site? So in terms of value retention, the first thing to consider is whether or not you can refurbish and upgrade that asset rather than demolishing and rebuilding, having a new building. So just following this process, it then takes you down to a set of design strategies that across the bottom, looking at design for recoverability, reusability, flexibility, adaptability, and longevity. And it will be different depending on the lifespan of the asset and the stage that it's at the moment in time when you're making those key decisions. So that's a very important stage to get that right, because from that you can then look at more specific aspects of, for example, procurement. And I flagged up procurement as being a really critical stage in terms of the client setting the agenda for sustainability and then making sure that it's implemented. And looking at it from the perspective of circular economy, there's actually there's quite a good report that's been produced recently from the Big Buyers Initiative for Climate Change, and looking at public procurement of circular construction materials. And there's some really good case studies in there, and very worthwhile to read. But I thought I'd just flag up some of the lessons that came out of that. So there were sort of three key areas. So one was looking at the deconstruction demolition phase. The other was looking at more of the new construction and renovation. And then the third was actually then using public levers to promote circular construction. So just sort of looking at the deconstruction demolition projects first, a really critical thing, and this is what I've been doing recently actually, it's Meridian Water for a building that's due to be potentially demolished, is to produce this materials inventory. So to understand what's there and do an independent evaluation. And this could actually be the stage before, which is where you're actually then deciding whether or not to to refurbish an asset, or whether or not actually it's going to have to be demolished. But it's either a pre-refurbishment or a pre-demolition audit. But essentially trying to really understand what's in that building and what can be retained, and what's going to be the best management strategy for the rest of it. And then by doing that, that then gives you the information, and if it's done sufficiently in advance, it also gives the time to then start to think about, well, okay, how do I maybe reincorporate some of these products and materials back into further development? And that takes time, but it also needs to involve the design team. So there's that linking in through the planning and the partnerships that's really important to maximise that bank of materials and products that's already there. And I suppose the area that people focus on mainly is, new construction. How do we get the most sustainable building or the most sustainable asset? But it's equally relevant for renovation, which is to do that strategic approach. So the diagram that I showed previously, to really think about the asset and how it needs to be used, and how it needs to be, maybe needs to change from one use to another, or it maybe needs to adapt in terms of capacity or function. So those are really important things to understand at that stage. And then from that, you can then consider the best design strategy. So, for example, designing for disassembly, for future reuse, for adaptability to improve the longevity of those assets. And then looking at the procurement, once the main design concepts have been established, then looking at procurement to make sure that the lowest impact products and materials and systems are being incorporated. So it could be from a whole life carbon perspective, so considering embodied carbon and operational carbon, but it could also be looking at what's the bank of products and materials that are there on site potentially that can be harvested. And then the third area, which is the public levers, and I was really pleased to see the level of ambition and determination to actually start to use public procurement and public policy to really drive circular construction, because we really do need that, because otherwise nothing's going to change. And just really referring again to the London Circular Economy Statement, because that's a really important regulation that's going to incentivise circular construction for those referable developments. And it's only been this year really that's been implemented. So what's going to be really interesting to see how it then changes the supply chain, and how the level of ambition changes over the next few years. So there's lots of case studies out there. So I talked about the public, the big buyers lessons learned document, but there are lots of other case studies. There's lots from the Netherlands. They've been very, very advanced compared to other places in terms of public procurement and circular economy. They've got some very good tools to measure value across the three aspects of social, economic, and environmental performance. And here's just so Rijkswaterstaat is the public procurer that's got lots of case studies in terms of circular economy in the Netherlands. But they've done some really, really innovative and exciting projects that we can learn from. So just to really quickly move to the conclusions, there's quite a lot more I could have talked about, but just to flag up some of the key areas from my perspective. I think when you're looking at the strategy, so ideally having a circular economy strategy and some key actions for implementation, but it's very important to understand the difference between what's going to have a direct impact, so actually make a difference in terms of, for example, reducing embodied carbon, and what are the enablers for circular economy. So, for example, undertaking a pre-demolition audit in itself won't necessarily have an impact. You then have to do something. You have to follow those recommendations. The value retention hierarchy, again, is really important, because it moves from the old traditional waste hierarchy to one where it's much more about trying to retain the value of the assets and to reduce impact across the board through following that hierarchy. And then if we move to the development level, another sort of, it's buzzwordy, but systems thinking, it's really important to sort of understand the whole development and what are the opportunities. So, for example, the nature-based solutions in themselves could reduce the requirement for grey infrastructure. So in that sense, you're then reducing a whole lot of embodied carbon and materials requirements. So understanding that system and looking at those opportunities, mapping them, and then working out what you're going to prioritize, again, is quite important at the development level, as is the whole smarter design, looking at the whole life carbon, and then making sure that things have been procured to make sure that those strategic objectives, those actions are actually implemented, and then obviously monitor to make sure they are implemented. Then just moving quickly into the building asset level, there's obviously design issues, but then implementing that throughout the whole life is really important, because otherwise it just becomes a design wish and not necessarily a reality if things aren't actually taken out for future reuse or adapted. And the data issue is really fundamental to that, because if you can't access that information, then quite a lot of that, the really important stuff, so for example, how the connection's been made, who was the original supplier, if that's lost, then a lot of the opportunity is lost with it, which sort of takes us to the product and component level. And just really, why not think about buying in the service, so lighting, rather than having all the fixtures and fittings and all the stuff that goes with that. Buying a service can quite often be very effective in terms of spreading the cost, the whole life costs, to have a much more efficient and a much more circular type system being put in, because it actually never leaves the ownership of the supplier. And again, the data part of things is really important, as is the repairability, the independence of products and systems, so that you can actually, if one bit fails, you don't have to replace everything. You can just replace the bit that needs to be replaced. So very quick, we take a breath now, but yeah, so thanks for listening, and back to you, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And yeah, I apologise for the short amount of time. All three presenters have had to get their piece across, but I think we've had some really good introductions to the different areas all through the three presentations. So if I can ask, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. Now there's a few questions in there, and there's been actually some quite good conversation going on in the sidebar. So I'll go through some of them questions now. So if you've got any questions, please put them in there, and we can propose them in the time we've got left to our three presenters. So I can ask the three presenters to open their mics, and we'll go through some of the questions. So one of the first questions we've got from a Tony Broom is looking at, we've had these really high requirements to reduce our carbon footprint, but do we think that the supply chain, the industry out there at the moment, is ready to be able to assist us in delivering this future, these future requirements, especially as the military has put a start date in there for September 21. So I think first I may propose this question to Sally and see her perspective on how she thinks the industry is geared up for it, and we'll see where we go there.
Thank you. Thanks. The industry, yeah, we're still getting our heads around what it means to deliver on these targets. And I think some of the roadmaps that have been published are really, really useful because they help to illustrate what it means, what we can do that's tangible. So we've had the water industry. They published their net zero roadmap last year. We've just had Highways England published theirs. The Environment Agencies was just last week. We had the Department for Transport publish their decarbonisation plans. And so it's good that we've got these frameworks now within which to work, and it's for us then as engineers and professionals working in construction to make that happen. And I think, as I alluded to earlier, that starts with clients setting the right specifications and the right procurement strategies, and setting the incentives that by which all of the supply chain need to align and deliver. I'm being approached by some of those who are in our value chain in Mott MacDonald's around what are we doing around net zero, and we too are asking our supply chain as well to map, and we've got so many. When you think, working across the world, we're working with our suppliers, our partners, and our clients. And so it's enormously complex. So the easier and simpler we can make it, then the easier it will be. So we're on a journey, that classic phrase. But I think people are being really earnest now about making it real.
Thank you for that, and yeah, you proposed the answer to that question really well. Thank you. So I'm going to move on the question to the next one now, and I'm going to propose this one to Gilly, if this is all right, because you were talking about understanding the cost of the materials in that whole life cycle piece. So there's been a number of comments about sustainable finance and making sure that there's correct funding streams, sustainable funding streams in there. Do you think at the moment there's enough mechanisms, enough organisations out there to help understand that cost of the buildings throughout their lifespan and how we can finance the recycling of these materials? Is that industry there?
Well, I mean, I've done quite a lot of work in terms of how do you assess the difference between circular economy type scenarios and business as usual scenarios. So we looked at the economic side of things as well as the environmental and the social side of things. And I have to say it's quite difficult. The economic side of things is actually quite difficult using the current methodologies for life cycle costing in particular, which is how you normally look at the costs. It's not so much the value, it's the cost of a building over the whole life of it. And what's difficult is actually demonstrating that value. So what is the value of the products and materials that are contained within that asset? And to answer your question, no, we don't have a particularly good way of doing that at the moment. There are examples of where people have tried to do that to attach a residual value. But again, I think that's something that's coming. So the materials inventory for an asset, and it doesn't necessarily need to be one that's about to be demolished. So BREEAM in use, for example, there's a requirement to do like an inventory, an asset inventory. So that can help understand what's in the building or in the asset, and then from that we can then start to think about how do we then value things better. So they become a materials bank, but they're a quantifiable materials bank that can then have finance attached to it in some way. But yeah, we've got a way to go on that score. Thank you for
that. So the next question really we've got, I think is more directed towards the general, is Robert Ridley has mentioned that our doctoring has been taking a long time to change within the military. Do we think that these practices, what are coming online, is our doctoring going to keep pace with what we need to do in the future?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I think it's a very fair challenge from Rob. But I am optimistic, and the reason I would offer optimism, I'll give you a few illustrative examples. 12 months, 18 months ago, if I was staffing a business case, or if the team were staffing a business case for whether it be a major GMPP scale project, part of Army basing program or defence estate optimization, so part of that 1.8 billion and 3 billion 15-year GMPP scale programs, or at the other end of the spectrum, something fairly minor in the small projects, single figure millions. We would have gone through a scrutiny and approvals process, which required us to argue in having sustainability as a factor. So there would have been a requirement to justify why one was doing it and go through all the tortuous bureaucratic hoops of justifying what, for anyone on this call, I hope would appreciate, would be a application of common sense and a no-brainer. The shift in policy is that one now has to argue out why one doesn't do it. So the exception to the rule is why you shouldn't rather than why you should. So that's illustrative of the change in Army policy, business case staffing, but it's also illustrative of the culture and mindset change, which I think is critical. The formality of JSPs will take longer, as there are all of the bureaucratic hoops of getting all the services to sign off. But I think JSP 850 as there for guidance of the wise, the obedience of fools. It's the baseline requirement. I don't see I see the resistance having withered on the vine to argue for resourcing sustainability in the same way that we now consider health and safety considerations, whereas 2 or 3 decades ago we might have had to argue in why we did something in that arena. It becomes part of it's normalized. I mean, I'm very seized by Gilly's circular economy detail insofar as I don't think we've quite formally hardwired that in, and therefore there is a lot more to do. But I'm quite enthused by the pace of change, as opposed to it doesn't cause me any unease. I'm delighted with it. The environment of policy change is dynamic, and I think where we have challenges, and it plays to some of the other questions in the sidebar, how we measure, how we apply international greenhouse gas protocols for how we measure carbon emissions is important. That's still changing and evolving. How our defense analytics for how, who is emitting what, how we apportion, how we monetize, how we track and monitor the carbon credentials of industry, of Sally's work, to ensure that industry feel that they have a safe baseline, which is with a common framework for reporting. I think industry is delighted with the fact it now doesn't have to do multiple options, one that's sustainability compliant and one that isn't, because their customer, in this case the Army and Defence, is showcasing good practice, arguably, hopefully best practice, albeit we're not naive that there is much to do, much still to do in terms of more to do. Back to you, Peter.
Thank you for that. So I think I'll pose this next one to Gilly, but it's open for any of the other presenters to join in because it's quite a very round subject. Is so it's a question from Tony Boom, is circular construction will be greatly assisted to BIM. BIM seems to be slow in government departments for any government schemes. Is there any government schemes to hasten BIM? But I'd like to sort of pose the question of how do you think the circular economy piece can be incorporated into the data, which is building information modeling?
Yeah, well, I actually did this as part of the BAM project, Buildings Material Banks. We looked at how do you sort of data the environmental and the costing evaluation, which you can already do. So there are things like one-click LCA that help you do that, embodied carbon calculations from BIM models, for example, and life cycle costing evaluations. So that already exists. There are tools out there that help you do that. So how do we then sort of extend that into circular economy? So you can use it. You can use some of the data, but there's lots of information that isn't captured within BIM currently that you also need in order to make these decisions. And so we spent a lot of time trying to sort of understand what were the bits of data, the data attributes that we could use, we could recycle from BIM, if you want. And we worked with BRE's templater system to sort of try to standardize some of those attributes in terms of things like global warming potential. I mean, that already exists in terms of a standardized data field within BIM. So things like that we could use, but there were lots of other things that didn't exist. So things like connection type, in terms of reversibility connections, that information doesn't exist within BIM. So we sort of created a standard, like a new standard that could theoretically be incorporated into BIM to capture that information. But until they actually start going into the authoring software, then obviously that data won't necessarily be captured in the way that we need it to in order to enable us to do things like material inventories and understanding what can be reused, what can be recycled, etc. So very aware of BIM and the fact that it can offer a way of getting information. Yeah, it's like a foundation of information, but it doesn't capture everything. It doesn't give us the information in the right format quite often that we need in order to make these decisions. So hopefully the BIM community, and we worked with the BIM community, and I think they've sort of woken up a little bit to the fact that BIM can be used for these other applications, but I think that's like a wider discussion in terms of how do you then understand all the different data requirements across all these different applications, Circular Economy being one of them, and then how do we make sure they're integrated into authoring software in the optimal fashion, so that we're not having to put in the same bit of information several times because we haven't quite got our act together in terms of standardizing those data attributes.
That's great, and actually, I think you've just led into the next question really well here. So I'm going to propose this next one to Sally. But Damien Warren proposed a question: could the presenters offer their thoughts on how improving data generation and use for client decision making and understanding how sustainable targets are met? So I'd like to get Sally's thoughts on how's data mapping what we're doing, and how are we best gathering that data at the moment. Perfect.
Yes, yeah, thank you. And it sort of builds on Julie's comments just now with regards to BIM. I think what the Environment Agency is doing is really good in terms of pushing the boundaries. They now procure the digital twin of any assets that they're building. So there's the constructed physical asset on the ground, and then they separately purchase all the data and information that goes with that asset. And that's to just make sure that they get that timely delivery of that information. And they've got then that can be used then to create 3D models that can be used for training. And they've got that for the Thames Barrier, for the Foss Barrier in York, and that facilitates maintenance training and all of the benefits that go from being able to walk through a model with a VR headset. What they're also experimenting with is they've got a 5.2 billion capital investment program spread over the years, and that's prioritised at the moment.
I think we may have lost Sally a bit there.
Peter, have you still got? Can you still hear me?
Yes, I can still hear you. I think we've just lost Sally a piece there. So if we can go for the last question, because I'll be aware of time, I'm going to hand one question over to yourself, sir, which is come from James O'Keen. He's looking, with Defence Estate having a huge carbon footprint and impact, what do you see as the low-hanging fruit we could tackle at a tactical level?
So, I mean, following the carbon hierarchy of reducing demand, increasing green supply, and then offsetting the remainder, the sort of no-brainer activities in reducing demand, we've got to right-size our estate, which we're on. We've got too much old, inefficient, costly to run, and we just need to get over the fact that we don't want to hang on to swathes of the estate where we could do far better. The sort of less sexy end, which we, it's great to get senior officers and ministers to ribbon cut on solar farms, and we should absolutely be continuing that charge to increase green supply, improves the resilience of our estate, if nothing else. But we also need to do the sort of slightly less eye-catching stuff of building energy management systems and energy performance contracts. So, unlike, I'm sure Sally will have some great examples where BIM showcases great 21st century construction supported by a digital twin where the building is efficiently and effectively managed, because that's the norm in the private sector in best practice. Where's the norm in the military sector with our legacy estate, where we've suffered systemic underinvestment in the past, is that we have buildings where we've got the heating on, the air conditioning on, the windows open, and the lights on 24/7. We just need to get some absolute fundamental basics right, and we need to empower and incentivize our unit commanders, our COs, our heads of establishment, so they get a benefit if they pursue best practice, showcase best practice in this arena. I think there's a real cultural shift here. I want to see our use of the estate shift from a generation of passive tenants to a generation of active owner-occupiers who take a real proactive interest in how they manage their estate as we would our own homes or our own property. And we don't have that because we've not supported it well, and therefore we've created a sort of learned helplessness psychology and mindset. So simple, low-hanging fruit, improve efficiency, building energy management systems, energy performance contracts, but simple increased green supply, concurrently hardwiring into what we procure in the future to ensure that we, using routes such as BIM and data, which is the mineral ore, the gold mine of the future, making sure we harness and exploit the data to make the right decisions to deliver a more sustainable estate.
That's great, and thank you for that. So we come to the end of our time today, so I would like to thank our three presenters. We can't do this education piece and get this message out without you, so really thank you for joining us today. And I'd like to thank everyone else for actually dialing in to this event today, so we can learn more as an organisation, and that's what we as a Sustainability Forum is here to do. So thank you, everyone. I will send out a link to this video for everyone to share, as we've had lots of requests to do. And yeah, just thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks,
Okay.
everybody.
So,
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks all. Thank you.